In an age when nearly every corner of the African continent was being carved up and claimed by European powers, one kingdom defied the tide. As the flags of imperial conquest were planted from Cape Town to Cairo, one ancient nation chose a different fate. It did not bow. It did not bend. It stood firm, proud, and free. Ethiopia, land of kings, faith, and fire, refused to be swallowed by the storm of colonialism. By the late 19th century, the world had shifted violently. In 1884 to 85, European powers gathered in Berlin, not to assist Africa, but to divide it like spoils among wolves. The so-called scramble for Africa was not a diplomatic negotiation. It was a rush for control, extraction, and dominion. Territories were partitioned with rulers and ink on foreign maps, often without a single African voice in the room. France seized vast West African lands. Britain expanded its grip through Egypt, Sudan, and South Africa. Belgium carved out the Congo with unspeakable brutality. Germany and Portugal staked claims. And Italy, ambitious and desperate to join the imperial club, set its eyes on the Horn of Africa. But in the highlands of the east stood Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest Christian nations, rooted in tradition, sovereign governance, and unbroken royal lineage. With a history that stretched back to the kingdom of Axum, Ethiopia had centuries of civilization under its belt when most of Europe was still in tribal disarray. This was no tribal confederation waiting to be claimed. This was a nation with kings and queens, a written language, and an unwavering belief in its divine purpose. And as colonial powers encroached, Ethiopia's leaders prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Unlike other regions that were disunited or ill-prepared for the full force of European aggression, Ethiopia would not be taken easily. The empire was led by a brilliant tactician and statesman, Emperor Menelik II, who understood the stakes. When a treaty with Italy was discovered to contain deceptive terms that would reduce Ethiopia to a mere Italian protectorate, Menelik did not flinch. He rallied his people, mobilized his armies, and prepared for war. What followed was one of the most significant moments in modern African history, the Battle of Adwa. In 1896, Ethiopia faced down one of Europe's supposedly modern armies and won. The world watched in disbelief as Italian forces were routed by an African army. It wasn't just a battle, it was a statement. Ethiopia had shattered the myth of European invincibility. The victory at Adwa would echo for generations, inspiring movements of freedom and self-determination across the continent and in the diaspora. For African Americans facing segregation, for Caribbean thinkers dreaming of sovereignty, for Pan-Africanists envisioning a liberated Africa, Ethiopia became a symbol of pride and possibility. But Ethiopia's story of defiance didn't end with Adwa. Decades later, under the shadow of rising fascism, Italy returned. This time under Mussolini, with more troops, tanks, and deadly gases. And yet again, Ethiopia resisted. Though temporarily occupied, the fire of resistance never died. And when Emperor Haile Selassie stood before the League of Nations in 1936, pleading for justice, he spoke not just for Ethiopia, but for all oppressed peoples of the world. His warning would go unheeded until the world itself was plunged into global war. This is the story of a kingdom that weathered every storm, a nation that faced betrayal, invasion, and abandonment, but stood. This is the story of leaders who defied the odds, Menelik II, who would not sign away his people's freedom, and Haile Selassie, who raised his voice before a silent world. It is the story of a people whose unity, strategy, and faith shaped a legacy that colonialism could not erase. Ethiopia did what no other African kingdom could. It not only survived the onslaught of colonial ambition, it won. And in doing so, it preserved its sovereignty, its culture, and its crown. This episode journeys into the heart of that defiance, tracing the footsteps of kings and queens, soldiers and citizens through the battles, betrayals, and triumphs that made Ethiopia not just a nation, but a legend. Here, in the highlands of East Africa, an unbowed crown still gleams, a testament to what it means to believe in your people, your past, and your purpose. The kingdom that wouldn't bow begins now. Long before the word Africa became synonymous with colonial exploitation and foreign domination, Ethiopia stood as one of the world's most enduring and sophisticated civilizations. Its legacy begins not in the 19th century scramble for the continent, but in the mists of antiquity, where kingdoms rose not from conquest alone, but from culture, commerce, and faith. To understand why Ethiopia did not bow to colonial rule, one must first understand what Ethiopia already was before the first European soldier even dreamt of laying claim to African soil. Ethiopia's story begins with Aksum, an ancient kingdom that emerged as a major power around the 1st century CE. The kingdom of Aksum was not merely a regional player. It was an empire recognized by Rome, Persia, and India. Axumite coins bearing inscriptions in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's classical script, have been found as far away as India, attesting to a flourishing network of trade and diplomacy. The empire's merchants dealt in gold, ivory, spices, and frankincense, controlling ports along the Red Sea and facilitating exchange between Africa and the wider world. But it wasn't just wealth that made Aksum significant. Around the 4th century CE, under the rule of King Ezana, Ethiopia became one of the first nations on earth to adopt Christianity as a state religion preceding even much of Europe. This singular act would define Ethiopia's destiny. Christianity was not just a belief system. It became embedded into the very soul of the nation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed its own traditions, theology, and scripture, independent of both Rome and Constantinople. Its biblical canon included books not found in the Western Bible. Its liturgy was rooted in Ge'ez, its fasting traditions rigorous, and its worldview steeped in a blend of Hebraic and African spirituality. Central to this religious identity was a sacred claim few other nations could make: the Ark of the Covenant, believed by many Ethiopians to rest in the holy city of Aksum within the chapel of the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark was brought from Jerusalem by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This claim did more than stir legend. It anchored the entire monarchy in divine legitimacy. The Ethiopian emperors, generation after generation, were believed to descend from the line of Solomon, giving birth to what would be known as the Solomonic Dynasty. This lineage created a sense of not just national identity, but sacred destiny. The emperor was not simply a ruler. He was the elect of God, ordained to shepherd a holy nation. This idea fostered a culture of fierce independence and spiritual pride. Ethiopia was not just another kingdom. It was, in the minds of its people, the new Zion, a chosen land among nations, guided by divine favor. This connection between monarchy, faith, and nationhood forged one of the most resilient political institutions in the ancient world. While kings rose and fell in other lands, Ethiopia's monarchy claimed continuity for over 2,000 years, disrupted only by brief usurpations and power struggles, but always reverting back to the Solomonic line. Such a legacy inspired awe and reverence, both internally and beyond its borders. Foreign travelers and emissaries who visited Ethiopia through the centuries often described it with a sense of wonder as a Christian kingdom cloaked in mystery, high in the mountains, defending its faith and heritage against all odds. And defend it they did. Ethiopia's geography played a role in its preservation. The country's highland terrain, dramatic ridges, and deep valleys acted as a natural fortress. But even more important was the cultural and spiritual unity that its people shared. Despite ethnic and linguistic diversity, Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, Sidama, and more, the unifying force of the monarchy and the church created a sense of collective identity. In this unity, Ethiopians found strength. They did not see themselves as a fractured mass of tribes, but as the stewards of a divine legacy, fiercely proud of their independence. Before the 19th century, Ethiopia's map stretched across much of the Horn of Africa. While its borders shifted through centuries of regional wars and dynastic disputes, its influence remained undeniable. From the shores of the Red Sea to the edges of the Nile Valley, Ethiopia projected power through alliances, military campaigns, and trade. Ancient maps often referred to the entire region as Abyssinia, a term that captured the imagination of explorers, missionaries, and monarchs alike. The country's interactions with Europe began long before colonialism. Portuguese emissaries and Jesuit priests arrived in the 16th century, hoping to forge Christian alliances against Islamic powers. For a brief period, their influence grew. But when the Jesuits attempted to impose Roman Catholicism on the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the empire pushed back. Foreign priests were expelled, and Ethiopia reaffirmed its sovereignty, not just politically, but spiritually. This act of resistance, centuries before Adwa, showcased Ethiopia's uncompromising resolve to remain Ethiopian in essence, not merely in name. All of this, its ancient faith, mythic origins, unbroken monarchy, and cultural defiance made Ethiopia more than just another African kingdom. It became a symbol, a beacon of black independence in a world that increasingly viewed Africa as a continent to be dominated. To African Americans in bondage, Ethiopia became the promised land, a place that had never been colonized, where black kings still ruled and where God's justice seemed to prevail. The scriptures themselves spoke of it. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. These words, recited in slave churches and freedom movements, gave spiritual language to political longing. Ethiopia was more than a place. It was a prophecy. As the 19th century wore on and colonial powers circled like vultures, Ethiopia remained distinct. It had its own script, its own calendar, its own religion, its own crown. It had no need for foreign governance nor foreign validation. What it had was legacy, 1,000 years of kingdomhood, and an unshakable belief in its right to exist on its own terms. That legacy would soon be tested. The ambitions of Europe, disguised as treaties and diplomacy, would seek to ensnare the empire in the machinery of colonization. But the Ethiopia that faced down these powers was not one born yesterday. It was a nation forged in the fires of faith and memory. It carried within it the pride of Axum, the authority of Solomon, and the unrelenting resolve of a people who knew who they were. Before the first shot was fired at Adwa, before Mussolini's bombers darkened the sky, Ethiopia had already won something no invader could take, the power of identity. And that, more than armies or treaties, would prove to be its greatest weapon. By the close of the 19th century, the continent of Africa was no longer viewed by European powers as a distant land of mystery. It had become a buffet of opportunity, ripe for exploitation, conquest, and control. In a chilling display of imperial arrogance, the European powers gathered in Berlin between November 1884 and February 1885 to organize what would become known as the Scramble for Africa. This infamous Berlin Conference, orchestrated by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, was less a diplomatic summit and more a quiet conspiracy to carve up an entire continent without the consent or even the presence of its people. At this conference, no African nations were invited. No kings or elders were asked for their input. Instead, bureaucrats, diplomats, and monarchs from Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy used rulers and maps to draw imaginary lines across the face of Africa, dividing up territories, splitting ethnic groups, and disregarding millennia of indigenous rule and sovereignty. Entire kingdoms were handed over in theory, long before a single European soldier had set foot on their soil. In the minds of these imperial architects, Africa was nothing more than a resource-rich jigsaw puzzle, and colonialism the only legitimate future for its people. Britain claimed vast stretches from Egypt to South Africa, envisioning a continuous corridor of control from north to south. France expanded westward, gobbling up enormous territories in West and Central Africa. Belgium claimed the Congo, plunging it into one of the darkest periods of human exploitation in modern history. Germany took Namibia, Cameroon, and parts of East Africa. Even Portugal, long past its golden age, fought to hold on to Angola and Mozambique. And then there was Italy, the hungry latecomer. Italy, unified as a modern state only in the 1860s, had missed out on the earlier colonial expansions that enriched its European neighbors. Eager to catch up and earn a seat at the table of imperial powers, Italy set its sights on the Horn of Africa. In 1882, it began its colonial journey by purchasing the port of Assab on the Red Sea coast, slowly expanding its foothold into what would become Eritrea. But its ambitions went further. Italy eyed Ethiopia, a vast, mountainous, and independent empire that stood as one of the last unconquered jewels of the continent. At first, Italy approached with apparent diplomacy. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Wucheli, an agreement that was supposed to formalize friendly relations between the two nations. On the surface, it granted mutual recognition, secured trade, and outlined boundaries. But buried in the ink was a sinister trick, one that would set Ethiopia on the path to war. The Treaty of Wucheli was written in two languages, Italian and Amharic. In Article 17, the Italian version stated that Ethiopia agrees to conduct all foreign affairs through the Kingdom of Italy, a clause that effectively made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate vassal state under indirect rule. But the Amharic version, which Emperor Menelik II read and approved, conveyed a very different meaning. It stated that Ethiopia may communicate with other powers through Italy, implying voluntary cooperation, not submission. The word must in Italian became may in Amharic. It was a deliberate act of linguistic manipulation, an effort to deceive a sovereign emperor into surrendering his nation's autonomy without firing a single shot. When news of the deception reached Emperor Menelik II, his response was swift and unyielding. A shrewd diplomat and a student of international affairs, Menelik was no naive tribal chief. He had spent years studying European politics, acquiring weapons, and modernizing his army. He saw the implications of Italy's duplicity not just as a personal insult, but as a grave threat to Ethiopia's future. The emperor publicly denounced the treaty, asserting Ethiopia's right to conduct its own foreign relations and rejecting any claim that his empire had become an Italian protectorate. Italy, humiliated by the rejection and pressured by nationalist fervor back home, decided to pursue its ambitions by force. The Italian government, led by Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, began preparing for war. They believed that Ethiopia, like so many other African states, would fall easily. They had modern rifles, artillery, and European military training. What they underestimated was the resolve of the Ethiopian people, the leadership of Menelik, and the memory of betrayal that now burned in the emperor's heart. Menelik's reaction to Italy's deception was not just political, it was profoundly personal and patriotic. He began to rally the diverse regions of Ethiopia, calling on nobles, warriors, and peasants alike to unite in defense of their nation. In his proclamation, he invoked not just the dignity of the crown, but the soul of the nation. Today, the people of Ethiopia are called not to defend a king, but to defend our faith, our freedom, and our soil, he declared. Over the next few years, Menelik and his wife, Empress Taytu Betul, began to lay the groundwork for one of the most extraordinary moments in African resistance history. They called upon governors from every corner of the empire to contribute soldiers, provisions, and weapons. Diplomats were sent to Russia and France to secure additional arms. Blacksmiths and craftsmen were put to work forging weapons. Churches called for national fasting and prayer. Farmers gave grain. Women marched beside men. It was not just a mobilization, it was a movement. The betrayal of the Treaty of Wuchale had awoken something ancient in the Ethiopian soul. It reminded them of who they were, a people who had never bowed to pharaohs, caliphs, or crusaders, and they would not bow now. As Italy prepared for invasion, confident in its supposed superiority, Ethiopia prepared for redemption. The war drums were sounding in the highlands. The world would soon witness that while the rest of Africa had been carved apart like meat at a feast, Ethiopia had teeth, and it was ready to bite back. In the eyes of the imperial world, Ethiopia was just one more land to tame. But for Ethiopians, this was no ordinary political dispute. It was a betrayal of trust, a threat to centuries of sovereignty, and an affront to a divine calling. And when a people believe their freedom is not just a right but a sacred duty, there is no treaty clever enough, no army large enough, and no empire powerful enough to suppress them for long. Emperor Menelik II was no ordinary monarch. In a continent teetering under the weight of European ambition, he stood out as a rare figure, both deeply rooted in Ethiopia's ancient traditions and remarkably attuned to the demands of a changing world. With piercing intelligence, unshakable faith, and strategic genius, Menelik was the lion who would rise to defend the kingdom's crown. If Ethiopia were to survive the looming storm of colonization, it would need a leader who could do more than command armies. The Ethiopian Empire, though steeped in a proud and ancient legacy, had seen decades of internal conflict. Regional rulers operated like miniature kings, loyalties shifted, and the dream of a strong, centralized Ethiopia seemed more legend than reality. It needed a unifier, a diplomat, a visionary, and Menelik was all three. He recognized that Ethiopia's survival, its ability to resist not only Italy but the entire colonial machine, depended on unity. Letters were sent to regional governors, commanding them to mobilize men, stockpile provisions, and prepare for what would be the greatest test of their generation. Menelik's army was not a professional standing force like the European models. It was a people's army, hundreds of thousands of farmers, horsemen, spearmen, and riflemen who laid down their tools, kissed their children goodbye, and marched to defend their land. And they responded. And so, he began the arduous task of bringing together a diverse and often fractious empire. Born in 1844 in Shua, a region in central Ethiopia, Menelik was of royal blood, but rose to power during a time of political fragmentation. Many had never fought outside their local province, but now they stood united under a single cause. Roads were cleared. Rations were prepared. Scouts mapped out routes for water access. Thanks to diplomatic efforts prior to the conflict, Ethiopia had managed to import rifles and ammunition from France, Russia, and other European nations wary of Italy's aggression. And more importantly, every soldier was armed with something far more potent: spiritual conviction. Camps were strategically positioned near rivers, and makeshift granaries were established to sustain the army over long stretches. His call to arms was not a mere decree, it was a thunderous rallying cry that echoed through the valleys, across the plateaus, and into the hearts of ordinary Ethiopians. Soldiers marched believing that they were doing God's will, defending the Holy Kingdom from foreign invaders who sought to defile both land and faith. For many, this wasn't just a political war, it was a sacred duty. There, in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, the world would learn a lesson that would echo through generations. Unity, strategy, and spiritual conviction can triumph over the mightiest of machines. The lion had prepared, and soon it would strike. Her words were sharp and unwavering. Do not trust them. If you do, you will lose everything. In his addresses, he reminded his people that Ethiopia had never been colonized, that their ancestors had walked with kings, prophets, and saints. Let it not be said, he declared, that in our time the crown fell. Let us be the generation that held the line. It was her wisdom and backbone that reinforced the emperor's resolve. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a central role in the resistance. Crosses were held aloft before battle. Fasts were observed. Priests traveled with the army, offering prayers and blessings. Taytu was not only his wife but also his fiercest advisor. It was a fortress of faith, a tapestry of tribes turned into a single nation, a lion ready to roar. With Menelik's vision, Taytu's courage, and the will of the people fused together, the empire stood prepared, not just to fight, but to make history. Intelligent, politically astute, and deeply patriotic, she was a noblewoman from the north with commanding presence. She was, in every sense, a co-ruler and a lioness of Ethiopia. Menelik understood that an army marches not just on courage, but on food, water, and preparation. Ethiopia's rugged terrain was both a blessing and a challenge. He didn't just demand loyalty. He negotiated, married strategically, and offered positions of influence to those willing to stand under the banner of one Ethiopia. But Menelik, crowned king of Shua in his 20s and eventually emperor in 1889, saw beyond the divisions. She even commanded battalions in the field during the Battle of Adwa. It was a remarkable achievement, one that not only brought military strength, but also created a shared sense of destiny. The Ethiopian Empire was no longer a loose confederation of rival states. It was a nation being reborn in unity and purpose. Menelik reached across ethnic lines to forge alliances with powerful nobles and local leaders. Under his leadership, provinces like Gojam, Tigray, Wallo, and parts of Oromo territories were drawn into a broader imperial vision. When the deception of the Treaty of Wuchale was exposed and war with Italy became inevitable, Menelik did not hesitate. He summoned every province, every warrior, every patriot. From the Amhara highlands to the Oromo plains, from Tigrayan mountaintops to garage farmlands, Ethiopia stirred. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggest over 100,000 Ethiopian warriors were mobilized. At Menelik's side was a woman who refused to be confined to palace walls, Empress Taytu Betul, a force of nature in her own right. She rejected any notion of passivity. In fact, when Menelik first hesitated to sever ties with the Italians, it was Taytu who insisted on rejecting their manipulation and deceit. But Taytu did more than offer counsel. She led troops. She managed supply chains. She helped fortify encampments. Her role was so significant that some historians argue Ethiopia's victory would not have been possible without her unwavering determination and strategic mind. What made this mobilization even more impressive was not just the numbers, but the logistical brilliance behind it. The mountains offered natural defense, but moving tens of thousands of men through those highlands required incredible coordination. Menelik's forces used both traditional weapons, spears, swords, and shields, and imported firearms. Though not every soldier was armed with a modern weapon, enough were to balance the scales of battle. In Ethiopia, warfare was never just about land, it was about honor and divine calling. Psalms were sung as battle cries. Menelik used this spiritual unity to inspire and to unify. By the time Italian troops began to advance, Ethiopia was no longer a passive target. In the months to come, this massive force would converge on the hills of Adwa. The dawn of March 1st, 1896, rose over the craggy ridges of northern Ethiopia with the chill of anticipation and the weight of destiny. In the highlands of Adwa, nestled in the Tigray region, the fate of a continent was about to shift. This would be no skirmish. This would be an earthquake. By the day's end, Ethiopia would not only make history, it would redefine it. Two armies stood poised, one representing the brutal ambitions of European colonialism, the other a tapestry of African resistance, stitched together by ancient pride, righteous fury, and the hope of generations. The battlefield was chosen by the mountains themselves. Adwa, with its steep ridges, narrow valleys, and rolling highlands, was a land sculpted for defense. The Italians, under General Oreste Baratieri, had moved forward from Eritrea into Ethiopian territory with a force of about 17,000 troops, including European infantry, Eritrean askari soldiers, artillery units, and logistical support. They underestimated Ethiopia's terrain, and more fatally, they underestimated Ethiopia's unity. They were well armed, trained, and backed by the full confidence of a European power. General Baratieri, under pressure from Rome to act decisively, had hoped for a surprise strike to break the Ethiopian front. The rough passes and poor communication between units left the Italians scattered and exposed, and Empress Taytu herself encamped across multiple ridges, ready to encircle and overwhelm the invaders. By morning, Menelik's forces launched a devastating counteroffensive. Utilizing the terrain as both shield and sword, Ethiopian troops poured down the mountainsides in waves. Their artillery units, slowed by rocky passes, were overrun or rendered ineffective. Their infantry, fighting uphill against overwhelming numbers, began to falter. This was a multi-ethnic, multi-regional army with a single purpose: drive the invaders out. The air rang with war chants and prayers, and across every hillside the Ethiopian flag waved defiantly. But what the Italians had in firepower, they lacked in strategy. Over 4,000 soldiers were killed and nearly 3,000 taken prisoner, including high-ranking officers. Emperor Menelik II, commanding an Ethiopian force of more than 100,000 warriors, had chosen his ground with care. His troops were not just gathered, they were positioned. Menelik II, in a moment of strategic brilliance, leveraged this overwhelming victory to negotiate terms that would cement Ethiopia's sovereignty. Crowds gathered in the streets in disbelief. Newspapers blared headlines of shame, and the king himself faced political fallout. The crown was intact, and it had been defended by the blood and bravery of Ethiopians alone. The false protectorate claim embedded in the Treaty of Wuchale was publicly renounced. It became a symbol that African nations could resist, could organize, and could win. The victory shattered the colonial illusion of European invincibility. For many Africans, it proved that colonization was not an inevitability, it was a choice imposed by force, and force could be resisted. 3 massive Ethiopian divisions, each led by trusted generals from various provinces: Ras Alula, Ras Mikael, Ras Makanan. Adwa offered proof that Africa was not passive, not broken, not waiting to be saved. Some even provided covert military support before and after the battle. In intellectual circles, Adwa forced a re-evaluation of African capabilities. Africa had heroes. Africa had strategy. Africa had victory. And Ethiopia was the glowing heart of that truth. He expanded Ethiopia's infrastructure, introduced new education systems, and strengthened diplomatic ties with European nations, this time on equal footing. But the victory had bought Ethiopia time to fortify its independence and embed its legend into the fabric of African history. Women joined in too, carrying water and supplies, tending the wounded, and some, like Empress Taytu's battalion, taking up arms. As countries fell and flags were raised by force, Ethiopia remained independent, proud, and sovereign. It did not succumb. It did not sign away its dignity. It chose to fight, and it won. But as the unmistakable proof that an African people, united in purpose, can stand against the might of any empire. It is a story of faith, fire, and fierce independence, and it will never be forgotten. In Harlem churches and southern meeting halls, sermons were preached with Adwa as the central miracle. It was a collision of ideologies, one believing it had the divine right to rule, the other believing it had the divine right to be free. And on that fateful day in March, it was freedom that roared loudest. Black newspapers praised Menelik as a warrior king and declared Ethiopia the New Jerusalem. The sheer size of Menelik's army was unprecedented in Africa's colonial era history. This was not an uncoordinated mob. In the early hours before sunrise, the Italians began their advance. It was a humiliating rout for Italy, the worst defeat of a European army by an African force in modern history. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey drew inspiration from Ethiopia's stand, and in time, the Rastafari movement would emerge, venerating Ethiopian royalty as a divine symbol of black dignity and liberation. He divided his already smaller army into separate columns to navigate the difficult mountain terrain. But this division proved fatal. Ethiopian scouts, many of whom knew every trail and slope by heart, observed every movement. They employed guerrilla-style ambush, cut off supply lines, and used traditional horns and drums to signal coordinated assaults from multiple angles. At the heart of the storm, the Italians found themselves surrounded. Communications broke down, morale collapsed. And then came the Ethiopian cavalry, swift, disciplined, and relentless, cutting through Italian lines and scattering those who attempted to flee. The Ethiopians fought with everything they had: spears, swords, rifles, and even bare hands. It was not merely a military engagement, it was an eruption of national defense. By midday, the Italians were in total disarray. Their losses were catastrophic. Among the dead were Italian generals, their ranks stripped of arrogance, their uniforms stained with the cost of imperial ambition. General Baratieri fled, his career in ruins. Back in Rome, the news sent shockwaves through the government. This wasn't just a military loss, it was an ideological blow to the very myth of white European superiority that undergirded colonial expansion. For Ethiopia, the victory at Adwa was more than a battlefield triumph, it was a rebirth. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed later in 1896, forced Italy to officially recognize Ethiopia's full independence. No longer could Italy pretend to hold sway over Menelik's throne. But the echoes of Adwa didn't stop at Ethiopia's borders. Across Africa, still largely under colonial rule, Adwa ignited hope and pride. In the diaspora, particularly among African Americans, the news of Ethiopia's triumph stirred deep emotion. Pan-African thinkers like W.E.B. The psychological effect was seismic. Even in Europe, Adwa had its admirers. Russian and French officials, rivals to Italian ambitions, quietly celebrated Ethiopia's victory. Some racist narratives twisted the story, blaming Italian incompetence rather than acknowledging Ethiopian strength. But the truth could not be buried in excuses. Adwa was an African triumph, pure and undeniable. In the aftermath, Menelik II continued to modernize his country. He remained ever vigilant, knowing that colonizers rarely accept defeat for long. And what a legend it became. Adwa stood as the great exception in a century of conquest. The clash of empires at Adwa was more than just a military engagement. Adwa would echo through the ages, not just as a story of cannons and cavalry. The thunder of cannon fire had faded from the mountains of Adwa, but its echoes were just beginning to roll across the world. In the quiet that followed Ethiopia's victory, something profound stirred, not just in African hearts, but in global consciousness. For the first time in modern history, a black African nation had decisively defeated a European colonial army. And from Harlem to Havana, from Lagos to London, the ripple effect could not be contained. This was not just the story of a battle won, but of a world shocked into recognition. This ancient highland kingdom, once romanticized or overlooked, had now done the impossible. Ethiopia became a symbol of dignity and hope, a torchbearer for a colonized world longing for freedom. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia's reputation skyrocketed. To him, Ethiopia was more than a country, it was a spiritual homeland. Adwa had planted seeds that would blossom into a movement, one that dreamed of black pride, black sovereignty, and black redemption. Garvey's motto, Africa for the Africans, found its deepest resonance in Ethiopia's uncolonized soil. Rastafarians viewed Ethiopia, and specifically Haile Selassie, as a messianic figure, the embodiment of black kingship and liberation. Ethiopia had done what no other African nation had done, and in doing so, it had become a spiritual beacon to those in exile, oppression, and diaspora. Sermons, songs, and speeches drew upon the biblical association of Ethiopia with divine favor. The illusion of European invincibility had been shattered. Italy, still young and eager to assert itself among colonial giants like Britain and France, was deeply humiliated. Newspapers across Europe questioned how a modern European army could be so thoroughly defeated by an African force. For a people long told they had no history or civilization, Ethiopia stood as a bold refutation. This would not only open Ethiopia to trade, but reduce its reliance on foreign-controlled access routes. Menelik invited foreign instructors, sent Ethiopian students abroad, and built schools in regions that had previously known only oral tradition. His aim was to blend tradition with modernity, to give Ethiopia the tools of the modern state while preserving its cultural soul. The project was slow and difficult, but it symbolized Menelik's vision of an Ethiopia connected to the world yet not dependent on it. It had defied the imperial order of the day and emerged not as a subject, but as a sovereign. While Italy fumed, Menelik courted other powers, ensuring Ethiopia would never again be isolated. While Europe sought to convert and dominate, Ethiopia held fast to its ancient Christian traditions, uncolonized in soul as well as soil. The national embarrassment triggered political upheaval back home. General Baratieri, blamed for the failure, was disgraced. Prime Minister Crispy resigned under pressure. Across colonized Africa, rebels and reformers looked to Ethiopia and saw a model. A kingdom among colonies, it carried the hopes of a continent on its shoulders. Its victory at Adwa was not just a moment. It was a message, whispered across oceans and generations. We were never meant to be conquered. We are a people of kings. And we remember who we are. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. It proved that black leadership, African unity, and strategic brilliance were not things of myth, but of living history. The old narrative that colonization was a civilizing mission destined for success was now exposed for the lie it was. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church remained central to national life. For African Americans, still enduring the brutal realities of Jim Crow segregation, disenfranchisement, and racist violence, the victory in Adwa was nothing short of spiritual vindication. Empowered by its victory, the empire embarked on a path of modernization on its own terms. But by the time he faded from public life, he had cemented Ethiopia's position as a unique African powerhouse. The country was still surrounded by colonies, still threatened by imperialism, but it had proven something extraordinary. Freedom could be defended, and it could thrive. Menelik II, wise enough to know that survival would depend on more than military strength, began a series of reforms to strengthen the nation internally. It wasn't just that Africans had won, it was that they had won with strategy, unity, and pride. In the hearts of Italian nationalists, Adwa became a wound that must one day be avenged. Though Ethiopia had won the battle, the war of imperial ambition was far from over. In his call for Pan-African unity, he often pointed to Ethiopia as the living proof of what a united African people could achieve. Adwa was not a distant event, it was a rallying cry. It meant that Africa's subjugation was not destiny, it could be resisted. It could be overturned. American black newspapers celebrated Menelik II and Empress Taytu as heroic leaders. Churches held special services in honor of Ethiopia, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the leading black intellectuals of the era, would later write about Adwa as a moment of revelation. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, would go even further. He popularized the phrase, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king," long before Emperor Haile Selassie rose to the throne. That dream would eventually take on new form in the Rastafari movement, birthed in the 1930s, though Rastafari theology would evolve later. The victory at Adwa was its undeniable root. Meanwhile, in Europe, the reaction was starkly different. Military analysts, diplomats, and monarchs were forced to reconsider their assumptions about African resistance. Italy, especially, did not take the defeat lightly. But beyond the political fallout was a deeper, more dangerous sentiment: revenge. But while Italy nursed its bruised ego, Ethiopia surged forward with confidence and clarity. One of his greatest ambitions was the construction of a railway connecting the interior capital of Addis Ababa to the port of Djibouti. Education, too, became a priority. He encouraged the translation of important texts into Amharic, expanded the court's bureaucracy, and formalized aspects of governance to better engage with foreign powers. In diplomacy, Menelik played a masterful balancing act. He built relationships with France, Russia, and Britain, often leveraging their rivalries to Ethiopia's advantage. His court became a magnet for foreign emissaries, adventurers, and traders, all eager to engage with the now famous African empire that had stood against Europe and won. Underneath this modernizing vision, however, Menelik never forgot the power of Ethiopia's spiritual and cultural identity. It shaped the calendar, the education system, and the moral compass of society. Menelik ruled until his health began to decline in the early 20th century. The legacy of Adwa would continue to inspire liberation movements well into the 20th century. Ethiopia stood alone not in isolation but in independence. 4 decades after the thunderous victory at Adwa, a darker cloud began to form on Ethiopia's horizon. The world had changed. Europe had plunged into war once, and now a new ideology was on the rise: fascism, burning with ambition and ruthlessness. At its helm in Italy stood Benito Mussolini, a dictator determined to rewrite history. Where his predecessors had failed to conquer Ethiopia, Mussolini was hell-bent on revenge. This time, Mussolini sent hundreds of thousands of troops equipped with tanks, aircraft, flamethrowers, and modern artillery. For him, Adwa had never truly ended. It was an open wound in the pride of a colonial power in the face of Mussolini's aggression. He chose not to bow, but to stand and speak for his people on the world stage. And in 1935, he set out to erase that humiliation once and for all. Italy's new war machine was monstrous. Gone were the disorganized battalions and broken maps of 1896. The League had been formed after World War I to ensure peace and collective security. Haile Selassie had brought Ethiopia into the community of nations, but when he needed them most, they let him down. Words were offered, but no real action. Sanctions were weak and delayed. Dressed in royal garments, with calm but piercing resolve, he stood before the world and delivered a prophecy cloaked in moral outrage. Britain and France, wary of antagonizing Mussolini and still haunted by the trauma of the Great War, chose appeasement over principle. He condemned Italy's use of chemical weapons, its slaughter of innocents, and the failure of international law. From the skies came a new kind of horror-chemical warfare, including banned substances like mustard gas, unleashed on soldiers and civilians alike. Though his speech was met with silence from the powers that mattered most, it electrified those who still believed in truth. Mussolini declared it part of Italian East Africa and paraded his troops through the highlands as if the victory were total. But what he failed to understand again was the Ethiopian spirit. It made Haile Selassie a global symbol of resistance and dignity. Villages were bombed indiscriminately. Crops were poisoned. The laws of war were not just ignored, they were shattered. One of the most horrific acts occurred in 1937 when Italian forces, following an assassination attempt on the viceroy, slaughtered thousands of civilians in Addis Ababa. At the center of this brewing storm stood Emperor Haile Selassie I, crowned in 1930 as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. He was the great-grandson of Menelik II and had inherited not just a crown, but a legacy. He became a moral voice in a world descending into chaos, as fascism spread across Europe and Asia. And though his country was under occupation, he continued to rule in spirit and to plan for his return. Mussolini had allied with Nazi Germany, and Italy's grip on its East African territories became increasingly unstable. Ethiopian fighters, known as the Arbegnach Patriots, began a relentless guerrilla war against the occupation, but Ethiopia had endured. And no matter how modern the weapon, an invader could never conquer the soul of a people unwilling to surrender. Long before D-Day, before Berlin fell, and before Mussolini was executed, Ethiopians were fighting fascism with grit, faith, and blood. Again, it will be you tomorrow. The Italian army was forced to divert troops, spend huge resources, and endure endless harassment from guerrilla fighters. Ethiopia, though militarily outmatched, had turned occupation into a war of attrition. And Mussolini's dream of colonial grandeur began to rot from within. They ambushed Italian convoys, sabotaged infrastructure, and kept the flame of national identity burning in the shadows. Haile Selassie was a modernizer, a reformer, and a man of unshakable dignity. He marched back into Addis Ababa not as a broken king, but as a triumphant lion. In churches, prayers were lifted for the emperor's return. Freedom was not just won on the battlefield, it had to be defended in the streets, the hills, the hearts of ordinary people. The spirit of Adwa, of Menelik, Taytu, and the warriors of 1896 was rekindled. Even young boys carried messages through dangerous terrain, acting as silent couriers for the resistance. At first, there was hope. Ethiopia, now a member of the League of Nations, believed that international law and global diplomacy could prevent a second invasion. Ethiopia, in good faith, turned to this international body for help. Haile Selassie pleaded for enforcement of treaties and immediate sanctions on the aggressor, but the League failed. The international community looked away as Italy began its brutal campaign. Still, he refused to remain silent. In June 1936, after being forced into exile, Haile Selassie addressed the League of Nations in Geneva in one of the most powerful speeches of the 20th century. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." His words rang out like a trumpet blast. He spoke not just for Ethiopia, but for every small nation at the mercy of imperial aggression. He appealed to justice, to the conscience of humanity, and to history. Back home, however, Ethiopia was bleeding. Italian forces had captured Addis Ababa. The empire, once undefeated, was now under occupation. Resistance did not die. It went underground. It scattered into hills, caves, churches, and forests. These were not regular armies, but farmers, priests, former soldiers, and students who took up arms to protect their homes and honor. In villages, songs were sung in whispers. Italy responded with even more brutality. Entire communities were massacred in retaliation. The massacre of Yekati 12, as it came to be known, was a gruesome attempt to crush the resistance, but instead, it steeled the resolve of Ethiopians even further. Through it all, Haile Selassie remained in exile, lobbying Western governments, raising global awareness, and refusing to abdicate his throne. What Mussolini had hoped would be a swift victory turned into a quagmire. By the time World War II broke out in 1939, the Italian hold on Ethiopia was already crumbling. In 1941, after just 5 years of occupation, Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia with the support of British and Commonwealth forces and Ethiopian patriots. The fascist storm had come and gone. This second invasion, though shorter than the first colonial attempt, proved that the fight for independence was never one and done. It had to be spoken in courtrooms, preached in sermons, and whispered in the dark. Ethiopia's resistance during the fascist occupation became one of the first true anti-fascist struggles in the modern world. And Haile Selassie's words, uttered in Geneva before a world that would soon burn in war, still echo with chilling truth. It is us today. The world didn't listen then. But Ethiopia remembered. And Ethiopia survived. The year was 1941, and the world was again engulfed in flames. But amid the chaos of World War II, as cities in Europe crumbled and empires teetered, something remarkable happened in Africa. Ethiopia, scarred but unbroken, rose once more. With the help of allied forces and the unrelenting will of its people, the last occupied African kingdom cast off its shackles and reclaimed its throne. The lion had returned, and with it, a renewed roar that would echo across the continent. The operation, part of the broader East African campaign, moved swiftly through Eritrea and into Ethiopia. In a joint campaign involving British and Commonwealth troops, along with Ethiopian patriots who had never ceased their resistance, Italy's fascist occupation of Ethiopia was finally dismantled. He did not ride in as a conqueror, but as a redeemer, a sovereign leader restored by the persistence of his people and the vindication of justice. In his speech to the nation, he said, "Guerrilla fighters, many of whom had been resisting since the first days of occupation, joined hands with the Allied forces, guiding them through the mountains and delivering blow after blow to the retreating Italians." Then, on May 5, 1941, after 5 long years in exile, Emperor Haile Selassie, I returned to Addis Ababa. The scars of chemical warfare lingered in the land and in the memory of survivors. As he stepped off the vehicle that brought him into the city, Ethiopians wept, chanted, and rejoiced. With the same vision his grandfather Menelik II had shown decades before. Selassie pressed forward with modern reforms aimed at unifying the country and equipping it for a new era. The bells of churches rang out across the highlands. The ancient kingdom once again had defied the odds. He modernized the judicial system, promoted women's participation in public life, and worked to professionalize the military to prevent future foreign threats. Standing at the very site where Mussolini had once declared his false empire, Haile Selassie proclaimed a new beginning. Nations like Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria had not yet won their independence. Apartheid still gripped South Africa. But Ethiopia stood like a tall tree on the plains, a reminder that African sovereignty was not only possible, but sustainable. Leaders from 32 independent African states gathered in the Ethiopian capital, many of whom had recently shed the chains of colonialism. Selassie built embassies across the world, fostered international trade, and used his moral authority as a wartime survivor and truth-teller to advocate for global peace and African unity. Our enemies thought they had erased our name from the earth. No one of us can succeed if we all fail. His role in this continental vision further cemented his reputation, not merely as an emperor of a nation, but as a father figure of Pan-Africanism. May this convention of union last 1,000 years. The kingdom needed rebuilding physically, socially, and morally. Years of warfare had left Ethiopia's infrastructure battered. Schools and hospitals had been destroyed. It was the embodiment of a nation's resilience, a continent's aspiration, and a people's unshakable belief in their destiny. He welcomed exiled activists, freedom fighters, and intellectuals to Addis Ababa, in the flags of nations once colonized, in the voices of African children learning their true history, and in the soil of Adwa, where the lion first stood and never bowed. It was a living contradiction to the colonial narrative, a land that had never been fully colonized, a people who had not been broken. Ethiopia's flag, the green, yellow, and red tricolor, was adopted and adapted by numerous African nations as a visual symbol of freedom. Ethiopia had become a mirror through which the rest of Africa could see what was possible. A kingdom that had faced the darkest of storms and roared back with light. He traveled widely, delivering speeches at the United Nations, the United States Congress, and to European parliaments. Everywhere he went, he carried the memory of Adwa and the lessons of resistance. He described Haile Selassie as a guardian of African dignity. Similarly, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Nelson Mandela of South Africa were deeply inspired by Ethiopia's survival and its consistent stand for African freedom. To them, Ethiopia wasn't just a nation, it was a beacon. He offered them refuge, support, and most importantly, an example. But we are still standing. Ethiopia is free. Her liberty has been restored. Her sovereignty has been renewed. But the emperor knew that liberation was only the beginning. Roads and railways were in disrepair. Haile Selassie immediately set in motion a campaign of national restoration. He expanded access to education, establishing new schools and universities to train a generation of civil servants, doctors, engineers, and teachers. He also deepened Ethiopia's diplomatic presence. No longer would Ethiopia stand isolated in the court of nations. And all of this happened while most of Africa remained under colonial rule. In the 1940s and early 1950s, the map of Africa was still dominated by British, French, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies. Haile Selassie's Ethiopia became a symbol for liberation movements across the continent. Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of Ghana's independence struggle and later its first president, often spoke of Ethiopia with reverence. In 1963, that beacon became the lighthouse for an entire movement when Haile Selassie hosted the founding of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. Together, they declared their commitment to African solidarity, unity, and cooperation, aiming to support the remaining nations still fighting for independence. In his opening address, Selassie told the assembled heads of state, "The problems which confront us demand the united efforts of us all." The OAU would later evolve into the African Union, but it was in Ethiopia, under Selassie's guidance, that Africa's political unity took its first formal steps. While the rest of the world debated the Cold War, Haile Selassie focused on the moral war, the ongoing fight for dignity, sovereignty, and equal partnership on the world stage. Ethiopia, though imperfect and facing internal challenges, stood tall among nations. By the time the wave of African independence swept across the continent in the 1950s and 1960s, many liberation leaders looked to Ethiopia not only for inspiration but for identity. In the end, Haile Selassie's story was more than the tale of a monarch. And though the roar may have quieted in the years to come, its echoes live on in the hearts of those who fight for justice. Ethiopia's redemption was never just its own. It was Africa's. Long after the battles were fought and the treaties signed, Ethiopia's legacy grew beyond its borders, beyond politics, and beyond even the reach of empires. In a world where Africa was too often portrayed as broken or backward, Ethiopia stood defiantly different. But land that had never been colonized, a kingdom rooted in antiquity, and a symbol that kindled a sense of pride and identity in black communities across the world. It wasn't just a place on the map. Ethiopia became a mythic homeland, a spiritual axis, and a rallying cry for freedom. Nowhere was this more deeply felt than in the birth and blossoming of the Rastafari movement. At a time when the Caribbean and the Americas were still reeling from the aftermath of slavery, colonialism, and racial injustice, Ethiopia offered an alternative history. Here was a black empire, older than Europe, untouched by colonial rule, and steeped in its own spiritual and cultural traditions. For him and for many Rastafarians, it was not just a journey to another country, it was a homecoming. Across the African diaspora, from Harlem to Havana, from London to Lagos, Ethiopia remained a potent symbol of black consciousness. In civil rights speeches, Ethiopia was a reminder that black greatness did not begin in chains. It began with kings, queens, empires, and philosophies that predated the so-called civilized world. Ethiopia disrupted the historical amnesia that colonial education systems had imposed on generations of African-descended people. It restored a sense of origin and strength. Its flag green, yellow, and red became the Pan-African palette, a visual shorthand for resistance, unity, and pride. These colors were later adopted by numerous African nations after independence and by global movements seeking to affirm black identity. In art, literature, and activism, references to the land of the Lion of Judah appeared again and again. It is both the home of Lalabella's rock-hewn churches and the headquarters of the African Union. In a world that tried to erase black sovereignty, Ethiopia remained a shield. In a world that tried to silence black prophecy, Ethiopia became a voice. It is the kingdom of the Solomonic Dynasty and the voice of Haile Selassie at the United Nations. It is the symbol that sat on Bob Marley's lips and the banner that marched with Kwame Nkrumah's troops. It is at once spiritual and political, mystical and grounded. Writers like Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou wrote of Ethiopia as a place of return, not always literal, but always spiritual. As the 20th century moved forward, the country faced its own internal struggles, political unrest, regime change, and poverty. But even amid these challenges, the mythos endured. Because myths, when rooted in truth, don't die with headlines, they grow through memory, music, and movement. In her poem Africa, Angelou wrote of the continent rising again, unbowed and regal. That image of the African continent as a queen found its real-world embodiment in Ethiopia's history. Though Selassie had passed away a few years earlier, the spiritual significance of Ethiopia remained intact. Palaces, cathedrals, and national archives became places of pilgrimage, not just for tourists, but for scholars, artists, and revolutionaries who saw in Ethiopia the essence of African resilience. Marley was buried with Ethiopian soil beneath his body and the Ethiopian flag draped across his casket, a final testament to the kingdom that had shaped his vision of the world. Unlike most African nations that had to fight their way out of colonial rule, Ethiopia carried a historical authority. Its ancient monarchy, spiritual traditions, and military victories gave it a voice that resonated even when it stood alone. Haile Selassie, as both king and diplomat, used this status to practice what came to be known as cultural diplomacy, using Ethiopia's symbolic weight to influence global narratives about Africa. It contradicted the narrative of black inferiority, and for the Rastafarians, it validated a powerful truth. Africa was holy, powerful, and worthy of return. Emerging in Jamaica in the 1930s, the Rastafari faith drew direct inspiration from Ethiopia's royal lineage. When Rastafari Makanan was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1930, bearing titles such as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, many in the Caribbean saw the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Rooted in the belief that Haile Selassie was either a divine figure or the earthly representative of God, Rastafarians viewed Ethiopia as Zion, the promised land, and Selassie as the long-awaited king prophesied in scriptures like Revelation 5:05. This belief wasn't only theological, it was deeply political and psychological. The movement spread rapidly, especially through reggae music, which became both a spiritual outlet and a form of protest. And at the heart of it all was Ethiopia. Songs like Bob Marley's War, which directly quoted Haile Selassie's 1963 speech to the United Nations, elevated the emperor's words into anthems of global liberation. Marley, the global voice of reggae and a devoted Rastafarian, sang not just about faith and peace, but about justice, revolution, and return. In 1978, Bob Marley visited Ethiopia. Though quiet and private, the pilgrimage was deeply personal. But the Rastafari movement was just one thread in a much larger tapestry. In the United States, black leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. referenced Ethiopia as a source of pride. In post-colonial Africa, Ethiopia continued to play a unique role. He invited foreign leaders, hosted global summits, and showcased Ethiopia's unique blend of ancient traditions and modern aspirations. This cultural diplomacy extended beyond politics. Ethiopia became an icon in fashion, music, literature, and visual art. In literature, Ethiopia became a metaphor for strength and continuity. Yet for all its symbolism, Ethiopia's modern reality remained complex. What makes Ethiopia's global legacy so powerful is its fusion of ancient and modern. Ethiopia's legacy lives not just in history books, but in the hearts of people who never set foot on its soil. To this day, when people chant "Africa must unite," when flags are lifted and dreadlocks are grown in rebellion, when freedom fighters raise their fists and scholars rewrite the curriculum, the spirit of Ethiopia hovers nearby not as a relic, but as a root that nourishes the identity of a scattered people, a root that reminds the world there was always a kingdom that would not bow. From the rugged highlands where the Battle of Adwa unfolded to the grand halls of Addis Ababa, where emperors once ruled and modern nations were born, Ethiopia's story is one of resilience, pride, and unwavering sovereignty. Under Emperor Menelik II's visionary leadership and the fierce resolve of his people, Ethiopia shattered the myth of European invincibility. The dark days of Italian fascist invasion tested Ethiopia's spirit once more. Despite being temporarily occupied, the resistance never ceased. The courageous fight of the Arbegnok, the unyielding hope in the eyes of ordinary citizens, it is leadership rooted in vision, strengthened by unity, and grounded in an unshakable belief in one's people and destiny. It stands not just as a monument to history, but as a living, breathing example of what can be achieved when a nation refuses to be broken. Ethiopia's story teaches us that sovereignty is more than political control. It is cultural affirmation, spiritual resilience. Let it remind you that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a people united by purpose and pride can rewrite their destiny. And the courage to stand tall even when the world expects you to fall. And riches in Ghana, a story of wealth, warfare, and the enduring spirit of another great African kingdom that refused to be forgotten. And the diplomatic courage of Haile Selassie, who called the world to account before the League of Nations, remind us that sovereignty is not simply given. It is fiercely defended. Ethiopia's restoration after World War II was not just the return of a king, but the revival of a people's dignity and the reaffirmation of their rightful place among nations. This victory sent ripples far beyond its borders, igniting hope among oppressed peoples worldwide, and altering the course of colonial history. This journey marked by decisive victories, painful occupations, courageous resistance, and triumphant restoration tells a tale that defies the often tragic narratives of colonization that engulfed the African continent. Ethiopia stands apart, not only as a historical anomaly, but as a beacon of what is possible when a people hold fast to their identity, unity, and vision. It is a symbol of African pride, a spiritual homeland for the diaspora, and a living testament to the power of unity, strategy, and faith. From the courage of Empress Taytu Betul to the wisdom of Menelik II, from the defiant roar of the Lion of Judah to the hopeful speeches of Haile Selassie, the kingdom's narrative is rich with lessons on leadership, resilience, and identity. The triumph at Adwa was more than a battle won. It was a statement to the world that Africa could resist and repel the tides of imperialism, yet the kingdom's trials did not end there. Throughout this saga, Ethiopia has maintained a unique place in history, an unbowed kingdom whose legacy continues to inspire. As we reflect on Ethiopia's journey from the battlefield to the halls of diplomacy, from occupation to liberation, we are invited to consider what true leadership looks like. The kingdom that wouldn't bow still stands today, its mountains, churches, and memorials bearing witness to a past that shaped a continent's future. As we close this chapter, we invite you to carry Ethiopia's story with you, not just as history, but as inspiration. Let it challenge your understanding of power and perseverance. Stay tuned for Episode 3, where we journey westward to the gold of the Ashanti. Resistance when others bowed. Ethiopia rose and still rises.